And since I have been going on before we came to this panel, I will not, and I've seen some of the familiar faces I've seen before, I don't want to repeat myself, so I'll speak in general terms only about the kind of sparks for the Arab uprising. And I think it's very important because there is a clear attempt by the United States government and by forces within the media to wrestle from the Arabs the motive and the thrust of what has happened. And I think the New York Times was very early on intent on denying that Arabs rebel on their own. The notion they can do that without outside help or nudge or guidance from the white man. I have to say that you have to remember why that is. I mean, you see, Arabs sometimes are given agency, and other times are not given agency. If Arabs are living under dictatorship, they are blamed for living under dictatorship. They are told that this is a symptom of their culture and of the religion, and that they have a propensity to authoritarian rule. Of course, those commentaries obscure the reality of struggle in all these tyrannical governments. The fact that in 2007 alone, Mubarak put in jail something like 7,000 people who he just accused of being sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I'm no fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, but just see the rate at which repression was going on by this close United States. And Arabs in Iraq and elsewhere and in Syria, before these even started, were being thrown into jail. They were fighting, they were being tortured. I knew Syrian leftists who were tortured in Syrian jails in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and in the new century. But of course you don't hear about that, especially when the Syria was on the US side, especially in the war in Iraq in 1991. So the West, however, when they do something they want to steal, like raising slogans of democracy and change, they want to decide that they can't do that on their own. So the New York Times actually started the story that somebody by the name of Gene Sharp inspired the Arab Uprising. I have to confess, I get really agitated and upset whenever I tell that story to an audience. Because, you see, I have a part to the story. I have a part to the Gene Sharp story. Back 4 years ago, a foundation in Boston called the Albert Einstein Foundation, I have never heard of it before. I've heard of the man, but not of the foundation, contacted me and said, would you be interested in overseeing a translation of a work in English into Arabic? And from their communication, I felt they were well-funded. So they sent me this tract, which is a typical, for me, very boring tract calling for nonviolence. So I read that, and I got bored before I finished it, and I made it very clear to them that I'm not interested in this project. They asked me if I would suggest somebody in my stead, and I recommended a friend who was a student at UC Berkeley, and he also was bored with that project himself. And that was the first time I heard with Gene Sharp. He was the author of that nonviolence tract. And all these years passed, and I never heard anything about it since. And then I read on the New York Times first page, must be like February or March, I don't remember, and it said that an American inspired that. And they said, Arabs were reading this guy's tract, which apparently was translated into Arabic, by the American. It's not like Arabs stumbled on this book and they were like, wow, we need to render that into Arabic. Somebody decided here that it should be translated into Arabic, just as there is an anonymous foundation which translates into Arabic all the works of haters of Islam into Arabic, like Irshad Manji and so on. They're available in Persian, in Urdu, in Arabic, and so on. So the New York Times made that story, and then a few days later, I was outraged. And I said, I gave the background, and they called me to do a follow-up story on it. And I said, I bet that nobody knew who this guy is. But this story caught up, and it was copied in many Western media, that it must be this guy. Of course, the story diminished in credibility because of the scenes in Libya. It was not a non-violent struggle. It was not in Egypt, it was not in Syria, it was not in Libya. The Arabs were intent on overthrowing governments
by all means necessary. If non-violent, it would be preferable. If not, they have resorted to other means in Libya and elsewhere. And of course, the United States is not a bystander. It has been arming and supplying the people in Libya among Western governments. And elsewhere, of course. So, I think it's very important to tell the story that it is an Arab story. If anything, if you want to analyze why Arabs have put up with tyrannical government for too long, it is because these tyrannies have been supported by the outside for too long. I mean, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf governments have bankrolled the Syrian dictatorship all these years. Syria was a very close ally of the United States for the 1990s, and they supported these dictatorships. And of course, 90% of Arab dictatorship, which means all the Arab countries except Sudan and Syria, are clients of the United States. It is not easy to overthrow governments that are armed and financed by the United States. Saudi Arabia, the most tyrannical government in the world, the one that is the most exclusivist, oppressive, misogynistic anywhere around the world, has just signed the biggest arms deal in the history, the human history. $60 billion worth of arms. Bahrain has just signed an arms deal with the United States. The United States recently announced they will supply bombs to the United Arab Emirates government, which has been persecuting 4 bloggers. How many of you heard about that? It's not in the news. Repression in friendly government of the United States never makes it to the news. And that's the reality of it. In reality, Arabs became convinced that nobody around the world is going to help, that they need to do it themselves. And I think based on the arrogance of this government, the fact that they got international sympathy made it very clear they will take it no more. And I think this is why what happened in Tunisia spreads throughout, because there are things that many Arabs hold dear together, the collective identity, and the fact that they are all inspired by the same issues and themes, like Palestine, opposition to American wars in the region, as well as the fact that they were all fed up with human rights violation in all these governments. Thank you.
Next, I'm pleased to introduce Mohja Kahf. She's a human rights solidarity activist who's going to be speaking with us today about the situation briefly for about 10 minutes.
Very briefly,
Very briefly, because I know you have to go. Exactly.
I have another event to go to, so my participation here has to be curtailed.
Okay, then why don't you take some extra minutes then, and since we won't have you for the discussion, take some extra minutes.
I have to be honest with you, being here is, to me, a distraction from, I am not about geopolitics. I'm not here to discuss Syria as a chip in an international game. My entire focus since February 2nd, 2011, has been working on a very zoomed-in, focused level on protecting and promoting for 4 issues in the Syrian revolution. Prisoners, and choosing that over other very equally deserving causes, such as the fallen, and working to promote the stories about the fallen, because my choice there was about let's save the living, let's save the ones who can still be saved or protected, as Syrians working with other Syrians to promote the names of the prisoners and circulate them at the grassroots to people, to make sure people know their names. And then if the human rights agencies pick them up, so much the better. If people want to pick them up and promote them, put them on websites on a grassroots level, matching up individual prisoners with organizations that may be interested in them, a documentary filmmaker and a filmmaker's organization, for example, that can help adopt the cause. So if anyone here has some suggestions like that, there are working people, there are farmers, there are athletes, there are all kinds of people who need help, because the news is the tip of the iceberg. I don't even watch it. I get the news from the activists on their Facebook pages and on their Skype, by Skyping with them and by emailing with them and receiving and translating documents and so on. So my focus right now is like someone who's very deep in a well, okay? And Syria, in brief, on March 18th, 2011, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and one estimate, which I find credible, and I can break it down for you if you want, puts it at 3 to 4 million people in Syria, which has a population of 23 million, took to the streets beginning on March 18th, and the government response has been brutal suppression on one level, and then on another level, a very wily game of narratives, trying to maintain a competing narrative, which has grown, exceedingly thin and threadbare in places, but there are still people bred on dictatorship, weak-minded enough to accept it. And luckily, though, the majority of Syria, and these, I count among these some of my dear relatives, I'm, in Syria, and also an incredible number of people who have developed a critical apparatus, which really, knowing the level of discourse in Syria over the past several decades, I have to say, even if it sounds condescending, I was bewildered how this level of critical apparatus had developed, and I had several extensive conversations with activists just out of Syria, escaped over the mountains to Turkey, and I now understand how that developed, and that's what I want to talk about, that consciousness change in Syria. It is not an Arab Spring. In Syria, we could not do it without the Kurds, a traditionally oppressed ethnicity. In Libya, there are the Amazigh. In Syria, this whole thing has just made me much more aware of the fact that we have to stop calling certain things Arab. And it's the Kurds, it's the Assyrians. The Assyrian Democratic Organization has played a key role for 10 years in the development, the push to change toward human freedoms and democracy in Syria. The Armenians, the Circassians, the Turkmen, but especially the Kurds. Let's see. Women have played an incredible role in 2 of the 3 ground, we call them Al-Hirak al-Thawri, or the ground Hirak, the actual grassroots. The actual, the organizers, logistics people, and the people whose feet are on the street, quickly developed into local coalitions. First town coalitions, all the protests, and they didn't all know each other before. And they quickly developed organizational structures in each locality. Those organizational structures quickly then developed coalitions. Those coalitions quickly developed rivalries, yes. And so there ended up being sort of 3 different clusters of Al-Hirak, or the revolutionary forces on the ground, the local coordinating committees, the General Commish, as I call it, or the Syrian Revolution General Commission, which is led by Suhair Atassi, the LCC, led by, in the sense of there is a diffuse and populist leadership of these groups. But she's sort of a figurehead, or a person among them that helped to bring the coalition together and whom they all really respect. And Razan Zaytouneh, another woman, another secular democracy activist, like Suhair, a human rights lawyer, is sort of that head person, or that symbolic leader, and an actual activist. Both of them are very much actual activists on the ground with the grassroots groups. For
These are
Razan,
the leaders of the uprising in Syria?
in Syria.
These 2 women?
Yes, part of the, not the leaders, like I said, leadership is very, I didn't interrupt yours.
And the Muslim Brotherhood is a feminist organization now, and I didn't know that?
I didn't interrupt yours. None
Okay,
of these are both secular, pro-democracy women who, Suhair Atassi, ideological background is from she doesn't have any party membership, but she came from a Ba'ath background, the portion of the Ba'ath that split from the Ba'ath Party and then had to go underground, and she's led the Jamal Atassi Forum during the Damascus Spring. There's a 3rd coalition that is the more Islamically tinged coalition of groups in the Hirak. The Hirak al-Thawri on the ground in Syria has nothing to do with the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan are an outside opposition group, and a lot of the outside opposition has stuff to do with the Ikhwan. My father was Ikhwan. I come from an Ikhwan family. My grandfather was one of the founders of the Ikhwan in Syria. Tayyib, bidda? No problem. Yeah, and the Ikhwan have a right to participate. I'm not Ikhwan. I disagree with the Ikhwan worldview. I would not vote for the Ikhwan. But the Ikhwan have a right, as all of the leftists, secularists, Kurds, Democrats, Assyrians, and other groups in the Syrian opposition also acknowledge the Ikhwan too have a right to political pluralism and participation in a free Syria, in free Syrian politics. So no, the Hirak on the ground is these three coalitions and then some sort of rogue groups and wildcat groups, and also the Free Syrian Army, which when the number of defectors began to grow and it formed its own, little cluster there. And an additional cluster called the Khalid ibn Walid brigades, and then there's the free officers, so there's sort of actually three clusters of defected army soldiers. But the mainstream of the revolution is those three Hiraks. The third doesn't have sort of an emergent leader, and even those other two, Suhair al-Atasi as the leader of the General Commish of the Syrian Revolution, and Razan Zaytouni as the sort of leader of the LCCs, as I said, represent. What happens then is that leaders, so-called leaders, get arrested. Arrested is the wrong word because there's no arrest warrant. Get arbitrarily detained, and tens of them are put in prison. And the same town has an equally populated protest the week later anyway, because leadership is so diffuse, and because what they are doing is growing leadership. There was a lot of talk initially about these being the revolutionary youth of the ground swell, the ground movement, and that revolutionary youth, were not necessarily politically savvy people. So there was this split that was seen between revolutionary youth and traditional oppositionists. People like Suhair al-Atasi kind of bridge Mukhadramin. They bridge that gap. She's a 39-year-old single mom. Razan Zaytouni is a 34-year-old human rights lawyer. A figure that is on the SNC, that the third group, the group that's tinged more Islamically wanted on the SNC, is Imad al-Din Rashid. In that third cluster is included a native-born Islamic nonviolence movement. Jawdat Saeed is 80 years old, the beloved guru of Syria's nonviolence movement. His first book in 1964 took off from a Quranic verse about why Abel refused to kill his brother, or to stretch his hand to kill his brother, even when his brother was intent on killing him. This has been, there are three generations of the teachings of nonviolence in Syria. They are radically different on a different end of the Islamic spectrum, from the Ikhwan, from the Salafis, from the Wahhabis, and very different from nonviolence as that term is used in Iran also, and in the Iranian opposition. These nonviolence movement people are not soft opposition. They demand the fall of the regime. They demand a democracy, not a theocracy. There's a Syrian nonviolence movement, Al-Hirak al-Silmi Suri, which began in April 2011. There's April 17 Youth Movement, which is another nonviolence movement, and there are about 12 of these nonviolence groups in and around the Damascus area, one in Hasake, one in Al-Jazeera, has nothing to do with the TV station, begun by Kurds, and another called Nabd, began by secular youths in Homs, Youths for a Secular Syria, that are doing cross-ethnic and cross-religious group work to firm up commitment to a secular Syrian state in free Syria. All of these have signed on and issued statement after statement wanting a secular state in Syria. They use that word in Arabic? They use that word in Arabic. Some of them use the word...
Which is what in Arabic?
Yes, there is this debate between Dawla Madaniyya, Dawla Ilmaniyya. In Arabic, Dawla Ilmaniyya with some I'm not going to let you dictate my agenda, honey. They want a democracy, not a theocracy. They want pluralism in Syria. They do not want an Islamic state in Syria. However you want to call that. If it's going to be an Islamic state and a theocracy, they're not for it. And there are these few little hotheads, scattered about the revolution that are not represented by any of these LCC, General Commish, or the third group, Al-Hay'a Al-Ulya, the higher commish for the revolution. These are all working cooperatively on the ground, little rivalries as they may be. None of those, no organization in the Syrian revolution, from the SNC to the littlest grassroots organization, has ever said they wanted anything but a civil dawla madaniyya demokratiyya hurra bi Syria, based on human rights and ta'addudiyya, for all sects and religions and ethnic groups in Syria. There has never been, to my knowledge, an official statement coming out of anyone legitimate in the revolution, not Khaddam and what's his face the other guy. Those are not legit revolution figures. Now I have to, that was my 2 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm really sorry I'm going to miss this debate.
Mohja, thank you. I'm sorry that you can't stay because we were hoping that you could stay for the discussion afterwards. But
the thought, I'm going to just leave you with this. Anyone who will throw rocks at Syrian backs while they are climbing to freedom, I don't even want to finish that sentence because it's not going to be, not going to be something I should probably be speaking in a public forum.
okay, thank you very much. Listen, we're here about having a discussion about diversity of ideas and the pluralism that exists throughout these popular uprisings. Speaking, yes, Asad?
Since she was indirectly addressing me, I just want to say, since she's leaving, so there's no room for exchange, and I really regret.
It's not in my hands.
And I
You
really
started
regret.
40 minutes
I know, I
late.
understand, and I really regret that you won't be here to respond to my criticism, which will be abundant. But I will say this at this point: if the accusation that I will be throwing rocks, you bet I will be throwing a lot of rocks, not at the Syrian people, at a reactionary conservative movement called the Ikhwan, which hides behind these civilian names they put out in the front. And if I were to hear what she said today, today I imagine that the Muslim Brotherhood has become a feminist organization. But then I remembered
No, believe
in the
me, they have
1980s,
not, and I'm not claiming that they are.
May I have the mic now. In the 1980s, I was in Washington, D.C., a graduate student at Georgetown. The Taliban and bin Laden and his friends, remember when they used to get funding from the White House? They used to go around the country and they used to do a show almost similar, word for what you did. That these are women, that they are Islam, but they want a secular government in Afghanistan, that they respect women, and they don't want reactionary conservative government, and they want people to be civil and democratic in Afghanistan, and we got bin Laden. It seems to me, if we let either the Syrian government or the Ikhwan-led opposition that this presentation clearly reflected, the Syrian people will be repressed again, and that's something they don't deserve. And that is why I will not be silent to hear propaganda of the Syrian National Council and their affiliates to obscure the facts of what's happening in Syria. Either the crimes of the government, or the other side.
Well, on that note, we're going to shift over to that's a tough act to follow, Monadel. I'm not sure. But one thing about Arab, we like to disagree. You know, we have a saying, if there are two Arab in the room, there'll probably be 5 different opinions. So, but we want to have this kind of discussion, and it's too bad that Mohja had to leave because we would have welcomed that kind of debate. No, really, I'm sincere about that. And yeah, for sure. So, Asad, Monadel, and Shimaa, the thing that I think most Americans and many people who consider themselves liberal have the hardest time and progressive have the hardest time understanding are the counter-revolutionary forces that are going on in the Middle East and North Africa right now. Because they look at situations like Libya and Syria, and like Egypt, and even Tunisia, and Yemen, and they get confused because they think these are relatively straightforward revolutions. But we can tell from the discussion that we had when Mohja was here, and at least in some of the discussions that we were having in the smaller groups, it's actually very complex. So I wondered if each of you could comment a bit about the major vectors of counter-revolutionary forces and how we can begin to understand it.
I think this answers to some of the things I will say in response to what preceded me. And I think this debate is healthy and it should be done, and it's happening in the Arab world too. And I think I should point out that I have recent history on my side. People like me, I support, I should say, some of you heard me earlier, I support the overthrow of every Arab government and I have called for that all my life. I never said a word of praise for any Arab governments ever. But I should say also, I'm not somebody who automatically applaud any group that speaks on behalf of opposition anywhere in the world, because I'm wary of some of these groups, especially if they have foreign funding, ties, and so on. And this applies to the Ikhwan Muslimin of Syria, and that gets into the counter-revolution. I mean, there are so many levels to the counter-revolution, which is spearheaded by the United States, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Israel in the region, and the willing dictatorial governments of the Middle East. But these are the partners, the four I mentioned. These are the ones who give the money, who use the propaganda outlets of Al-Jazeera, Al-Arabiya, and the rest, in order to mobilize people in one direction. And this is why I was rather seething to be exposed to the narrative about what's happening in Syria in a way that totally contradicts what's happening on the ground. I mean, here we have in Syria, I mean, take Libya. I mean, don't listen to my warning about Syria in the future. Listen to what happened in Libya. People like me were speaking against people like our guest on Libya. There were people who were coming to the West and making speeches and saying, the Libyan Transitional Council is a secular, democratic council. They will only bring democracy to Libya, and we need all to support them. And of course, you use emotional language, and you can shout and yell a little bit, and to evoke sympathy in the audience. And if the regime is an enemy of Israel, as in the case of Syria, you'll have a large audience, and you'll be invited on a speaking tour in many American cities. You have to run from one event to the other, and so on. In the case of Libya, as you all know, well, it's settled. We have a new government. Guess what? All the civilians who were put in place, who were borrowed from Qaddafi's dictatorship, are out. The fundamentalist fanatics, the Bin Ladenites, I call them, are running the show. And what does the head of the Libyan government, Mustafa Abdul Jalil, what does he have to say as the first promise to the Libyan people? This is a guy whose background was Minister of Justice in the Qaddafi dictatorship. I mean, this is like somebody with the credibility of, I don't know, Minister of Feminism with the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. So this Minister of Justice of Qaddafi's regime, who is now leading democracy in Libya, made his promises to the Libyan people. He said, religious laws will be put in place and polygamy will be brought back into Libya. So, shall I wait in the case of Syria for the Ikhwan and the civilian facade to come back and then to make these same promises and then to see that, I mean, for somebody to claim that two civilian secular women with a background that I respect among many others are running the show. I mean, in Libya and in Syria, there are genuine uprisings. But unlike in Egypt, which the revolution was not hijacked, or in Tunisia, in Libya and Syria, the counter-revolution stepped in with Qatari money and Saudi money and arms. They took it over and they put in charge a reactionary conservative organization with a sectarian background. It is not bringing every Syrian together. The truth is, the Kurds are staying quiet in general. Let me make sectarian generalizations, since some were made. It is not true that the Kurds are joining in, or the Armenians, or the Christians. In fact, the leaders of these communities are making sound of alarms because they are wary of some of the clerics, the fanatical clerics, who are now trying to hijack a very credible and legitimate uprising against a cruel dictatorship of the Assad regime.
Just a comment is, if we are going to discuss or debate the Syrian revolution, it also should be with Syrian activists that can defend the revolution.
Who are on the ground facing all of this.
So it's just,
No, one second, let me disagree. Of course not. I mean, people discuss Arabs without ever Arabs being around in this country. I mean, I lived for 35 years. I've heard Zionists speak on behalf of Palestinians all this time around. And no, I'm not going to ask any requirements that you'll impose on me. I don't have to speak about Syria now because it may bother somebody in the audience. We have to bring somebody who may, I mean, she had a chance. She was in the audience. She was invited just like I was. The fact that she had to leave for another engagement is not my fault. So I will not gonna censor myself because it may disagree with some of the things you don't like.
Okay,
So
I'll get-
your rule will not apply with me.
That's
Thanks.
right, but I'm going to also take I'm going to invite actually a colleague of mine, Dr. Rami Bailony. Rami, come on up and Rami is also part of the Syrian activist community here. Rami, have a seat. I'm going to let no, it's okay. Monadel will speak, and then I'm going to let Shimaa speak too. The question is counter-revolutionary force. Rami, could you say a little bit about the situation in Syria in relation to the opposition, and maybe we can start with that discussion again, and counter-revolutionary forces.
So what specifically do you want me to comment on?
Tell us, I mean, given the discussion you've heard,
First
you could just join in on
thing
this.
first, I'm a Syrian American. I was born here. Let's get that clear. I've been back to Syria a lot and interacted with the youth a lot over that time frame. So that's basically my background. And coming into the Arab Spring, I actually had always been a vocal activist politically for the rights of democracy in the Middle East, with the exception of probably Syria. I had been trained very early on to remain silent and be silent. So let's get that clear. But the first thing to me that marks about the Arab or Middle Eastern Spring, which is probably be called, is that I thought it was a way to get away from conspiracy politics, and yet I hear quite a lot of conspiracies. You know, Middle East has been driven by conspiracy theories for quite a while, and people use them to justify the political nature of many regimes and whether they stay in power or go. And we don't need them to justify revolutions, which obviously have a true justification for why they're there. Speaking of Syria and counter-revolutionaries, probably many of the counter-revolutionaries mentioned here today are true counter-revolutionary. The biggest counter-revolutionary to Syria is going to be the old patriarchs of the regime. That's the reality, that's the truth, let's recognize that. If Assad goes, there are still a lot of people who are loyal to the Ba'ath Party. There are old businessmen who have quite a lot of influence, and the old traditional Syrian culture is in fact one of the biggest impediments to true change in the country. So that's first and foremost. If we want to talk, do I believe, for example, that Ikhwan would be a counter-revolutionary? I actually do not. Do I believe, for example, that in the future, potentially religious struggle or strife could in fact come to impede a true democratic process? Possibly. But here's the difference. The difference is that the West, you know, the West for a long time has been trying to define to us what is democratic and what is not. Sharia is not a democratic force. It potentially cannot be. These Islamists are not democratic. These people maybe are democratic. And in reality, what it plays down to is, hey, if you like us and you want to support us in our view, then you will be, you know, you're democratic. And if not, you're not, no matter what the actual thing. With regard to the Ikhwan, I say let them play a political course. In the end, let me tell you something about Syria, specifically in Syria. The first 3 months of the Syrian revolution, all we heard was, this is really about a struggle between Iran and Israel. This is really about the struggle of Islamists with Hezbollah trying to regain force over the Middle East, but really, you know, Saudi Arabia is trying to counteract this. This is really about Turkey, and it's trying to regain influence over the region, and we're trying to do that. This is really about, you know, America, you know, and what they want and their influences in Syria. But the reality is what this is really about is the people, their dreams, their aspirations, their claims. So let them go forth. Let them make the decisions. Because in the end, I think there's been a cultural shift in the Middle East, and any counter-revolutionary effort will fail. It might take 10 years, it might take 20 years, but that's the way we're heading. Okay? So the youth in the Middle East will rise. You know, if a group wants to rise to replace it with tyranny, whether it be under the guise of Islam or some other religion, then that group will eventually go down. Or it will have to adjust to meet the aspirations of the people. So let us not play into the dialogue of the West with this group being that and that group being that, when people are serving bullets and facing bullets on a daily basis, facing torture on a daily basis, making an ultimate sacrifice while we sit on stage and discuss their futures. That is what I want to do. That's basically the way I feel. That is why.
Okay, what we're going to do now is that we're going to open it up for questions to the panel. I'm going to take 2 or 3 at a time. Yeah, hold on 1 minute. And I'm going to let Asad respond for a minute here. But What I'm not going to let people do is give an analysis. What I would ask you to do, please, is to make it brief and to ask a question. As I said, I'll take 2 or 3, and then I'll turf it to the panel. Asad, do you want to just say something?
Maybe just 2 points, very quick point. The first one about conspiracy theory. I mean, those of you who read me and follow my blog know that I am on the record as an actual advocate of conspiracy theories in the Middle East. I want to make it very clear. I think it's the other way around. I think if you have read Middle Eastern history, I mean, if you read the guy who was put in charge of the Palestine War in 1948 was somebody who was getting stipend from the Zionist organization. I'm talking about King Abdullah. I mean, you have to be foolish not to subscribe to conspiracy theories in the Middle East. I mean, when you read that Qatar now admits that it had forces on the ground in Libya, you have to be foolish not to believe in a Qatari conspiracy theory in the Middle East region. So I want to be very clear that I am a proud, unabashed conspiracy theory advocate of Middle Eastern analysis. Now, of course, there are kooky, unfounded conspiracy theories that I dismiss, like people who don't believe September 11 happened, or loose chain, or things like that. I don't subscribe to that. So there are respectable and unrespectable conspiracy theories by my taste. Second point, about the question of Syria and the Ikhwan. I mean, I don't understand what is being expected of us. So if you belong to the leftist secular camp, you have to do what the leftist communists of Iran in '79 were told to do. That you cannot prejudge Khomeini. You have to wait until he gets in power, and then give them a chance to rule, and then we'll decide. I say no. And please, I am with you on one point, which is the Syrian dictatorial, tyrannical regime is on the side of the counter-revolution. You see, in every government in the Middle East, there are 2 dimensions of the counter-revolution. There's a counter-revolution that is perpetrated by the ruling government, be it Egypt, being Libya, being Syria, being Bahrain. And it's sad that we haven't spoken about Bahrain at all today, and I feel guilty about that too. So if you ask, I'll answer. The second point, the second dimension is the regional counter-revolution, the one of United States, Israel, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. In most countries, like Bahrain, like Libya, like Bahrain, for example, or Jordan, the counter-revolution of the regime is in sync with the regional counter-revolution. In the case of Libya and Syria, because the ruling governments are not in sync with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the 2 counter-revolutions are not in sync, but they are counter-revolution nevertheless. So let me be very clear.
Where
The
does
Syrian
Iran
regime.
stand?
I'm sorry?
Where does Iran stand?
Iran stand on the side of the counter-revolution, on the side of the Syrian regime. In the case of Syria, without a doubt. I mean, that's an easy question for me to answer. You see, but you classify, I think that there's dogmatism among some of the Syrian opposition. They assume people's position immediately as soon as they criticize the Ikhwan. They think, you must be an agent of Iran if you speak like that. You see, it seems to me the Ikhwan has a background in the region. They engage in sectarian killing of innocent Alawites in the 1970s and 80s. They have ties to Saudi Arabia. They are sending flattery and flirtation messages to the state of Israel. That is enough for me to know. And I also know that a journalist who recently interviewed Burhan Ghaliun, the nominal token head of the Syrian National Council, the journalist who interviewed him told me that in the course of the interview, Burhan Ghaliun, the president of the council, was complaining to him that I am not going to accept to be like Jibril in Libya. I am not going to accept to be run by these Ikhwan people. And he was complaining about it. So now somebody in America is going to tell me it's not true, the Ikhwan are running the show. If the guy in charge is saying they are running the show and complaining about it, it seems to me it means they are running the show. That should not in any way minimize the intensity of our fight against the regime, but that goes along with the fight against the counter-revolution represented by the Ikhwan, Hizb al-Tahrir, and the various religious fanatics.
Okay, Rami, you get the last word on this, then we'll open it up for questions.
One, I'm in no way an advocate of the Ikhwan, just to be clear. But my point being is that in the end, we're distracting from the true point of focus, which is the people and their aspirations. Okay? I think Ikhwan can try to come and take that over if they want. But one, I don't feel they're as organized or structured as you say they are. Okay? And then 2 is that in the end, the people will prevail. That is my belief. And I think you can, we can try to play into these theories, but, it's better for us to take to the streets. We can.
Okay, Rami, would you, and then I'll go, after Rami, I'll go to Asad. So you want to address two of those questions at least, which is the one question about the Ikhwan on the ground, or is it just, are they bottom up or top down? And what can people here do if they want to support the revolution?
Okay. So first I'll speak about the economic question as well.
Okay.
The first one is, I think in Syria, the revolution clearly has economic lines. I think that's been the case and it's been clear. I mean, the first cities to get involved were the ruler cities and some of the smaller cities that actually have been relatively ignored from an economic development point over the last 10 years of the new Assad's hold. As we see it, obviously progressing, this changes and hopefully will eventually spread to the big cities. But it has clear economic lines, and that's been very clear. And the opposition has tried to organize general strikes to shut down the economy in order to bring out the rest of the people who have benefited from some of the liberalization of the economy in Syria over the last 10 years. With regard to the Ikhwan, you know, it's a hard question for me to answer because, you know, going back to Syria, I know Ikhwan of Syria and the United States. But to tell you the truth, in Syria, I don't know any Ikhwan in Syria. Like, no one identifies with them. It's not, I'd almost say that they're not really that existent. They're not organized there. They're no longer there. They've been crushed. And so I don't think I don't think they are on the ground at all. With regards to the leaders of the Ikhwan who are here, who are taking a role in the Syrian National Council, I don't think they're organized as well. That's my personal opinion, being Syrian and knowing the ins and outs of some of the Ikhwan here. I mean, I've had family who have been Ikhwan, and, you know, I have my own sort of grievances or so forth dealing with some of their ideologies. But regardless of that, I think that within them there are a lot of them who are very democratic on a personal level. Does that mean the whole group will take that force? I don't know. But speaking to many of them, that I'm talking about just the ones on the outside, because like I said, I don't think there are any inside. If they are, they're very small. Many of them want also to see a pluralistic. A lot of them are educated people who are not bent on Sharia, strict dominance, or these kind of words, which the West tries to define in a certain light to make it a certain way that's, you know, anti-secular and anti-democratic. And, you know, our vilification of them is just playing the same role in the same discussion. That boo-hoo, there's the boogeyman in the Middle East. His name is the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why they can't have democracy. Are we really going to play into that story? Are we going to start trying to create, you know, avenues of communication and dialogue and maybe achieve, you know, our own kind of democracy in the Middle East? One that's, you know, hopefully more equitable.
Okay, you know, the question on Syria, I do not disagree with anything you said. I'm in total agreement with everything you said. There's clearly a genuine, spontaneous uprising that is legitimate by the Syrian people that represents legitimate grievances. Every Syrian has more than one reason to protest against a tyrannical dynasty that has been set up since 1970, that has failed in all its promises, Arab nationalist promises, social economic promises, the fight for Israel. They haven't liberated an inch of the Golan Heights. So there are so many reasons to go against that regime, without a doubt. On the role of the Ikhwan, you see, so there is a general uprising, but there are also religious currents, some of which are outside, like Ar'ur and various other names that have ties inside Syria that cannot be denied. And there is the Ikhwan, there's Hizb al-Tahrir. Recently, an American journalist who was in Syria who was smuggled in to cover the uprising and to write about it. And his impression, he told me that there's more Hizb al-Tahrir, for example, which you don't hear much about, although some of their supporters inside Lebanon, in Tripoli, have been making noise in their support. The fact that there are currents that are reactionary and counter-revolutionary within an uprising does not, in my book, delegitimize the uprising itself. But it should, in fact, give us reason to bring up voices and criticism against those currents that we believe pose a danger in the future. Now, I mean, you say you go to Syria frequently, and I'm sure you do, but for you to say that you never met anybody who's Ikhwan, let me tell you something about Syria. The reason why you never met anybody who's Ikhwan in Syria because they'll be executed. Exactly. There's a law in Syria. I mean, there is.
So you're telling.
Let me finish. There is a law in Syria which makes, shows you what the tyrannical government Al-Assad is. It makes membership in that organization punishable by this. The second point about socioeconomic grievances, of course I subscribe to what is said, but I should add 2 points about it. One, the socioeconomic grievances are not only domestic, they are pushed from the outside. And look what happened in Syria. The Syrian government in the last decade has intensively increased the impoverishment of the population in the countryside because they have engaged in more capitalist policies. In the 1960s, for example, Syria incorporated more socioeconomic programs that were aimed at the poor. That is gone. This is a regime of few families that have controlled the businesses and the economy, and of course they are funding the counter-revolution of the part of the regime, the Dunya channel, and so on and so forth. The second part we need to say, and of course in Egypt and Tunisia, these economies were highly touted by the IMF and the World Bank and by the United States as an example of the success stories of developing countries. The second point we should be wary about for the socioeconomic analysis of the Arab uprising. Let us not go too far with that, because there are people like Thomas Friedman and others who want you to believe that these are, I heard Thomas Friedman say it on TV. Unfortunately, I get to see American TV news whenever I'm traveling. And recently, while in Baltimore, I saw Thomas Friedman say this: the Egyptian uprising, he said, that's going to really offend you. He said it was apolitical. They want to believe that because they want to reassure themselves as Zionists that the Egyptian people have no ill will towards Israel. Fortunately for me, the Egyptian people have proven the abundance of ill will they hold towards Israel in the last few weeks and months.
Do you want to say anything, Rami? Just quick.
I just want to say, I agree with you. You obviously can't say you're a flaw in Syria or else you'll be killed. But I think amongst many Syrians here, and we can bring them up, that you shouldn't speak for people who have been dialoguing with Syrians there and know, we dialogue. That people have been talking anti-regime for a while within Syria. We've been in those discussions. That was my main point. I also think that this shouldn't be a discussion about Holland. This should be a discussion about democracy and how we're going to achieve it. And I think I respect all your work, by the way. And just so you know, a background, when I did my thesis in Islamic democracy, I used a lot of your work. Just so you know, okay? But I really think you're almost falling into what you argue against, because you argue a lot against the way the West tries to define the Middle East politics by taking to the Juan story here. I really do. I do agree we need to be wary. I believe we need to be critical. We always need to be critical. That's how we're going to achieve a proper revolution. But I think we need to really, zone in on الشعب والشعب يريد إسقاط النظام.
So the question was, in terms of real threats, not conspiracy theories, what are you guys doing to organize to protect against that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, to me, I gave this in my earlier talk a little bit, and I obviously don't have time to go through the whole thing. But the way I see it actually is for me, the whole revolution represents I think what's the beginning of a cultural shift. And I went through 3 things which I thought were changing in the Middle East, especially amongst the youth. Well, one of the things that I think is to take, foreign powers in terms of internal decision making out of the process, by hopefully what is a decent democratic process. For the longest time, Arabic politics have always been reactionary to Israel and America. And I think what the revolutions are saying is that we want to control our politics. We want to answer our own questions. We want to take control of our own society. And I think that's just like, you pointed out that, there are many Syrians out there, and we're all watching, and we all basically want to build the future Syria. And I think, that cultural shift will hopefully avoid, obviously there's going to be external forces, but hopefully in the end, attempt to shelter those out as much as possible.
The question of conspiracy theory is intriguing to me. And I should say that people are aware of this debate over there. And there are responses, like for example on the media front. They're very aware that there is Saudi and Qatari monopoly over all the media outlets in the region. In Egypt, they are starting new TV channels. There is one that is named after Tahrir Square. and now it is one of the Tahrir channel.
It's not actually, it's controlled by the military as well.
You think it? I mean,
Yeah.
in the beginning it was free, and later after their intervention, they started censoring what's being said, controlling who's going to be invited and appointed. So I mean, that's part of the counter-revolution. You keep pushing and they keep pushing back. In Egypt, for example, there's going to be a new channel called Al-Yasariyyah, the leftist one, which is going to be an outlet for the leftist Egyptians who participate in the Egyptian uprising. I tell many Arabs in communication with them that one book to read about the counter-revolution is All the Shah's Men, which is a book written not by a leftist. He's a mainstream New York Times reporter and who studied the archives, and based on Freedom of Information Act, he got all the documents about the 1953 coup and demonstration right that the United States engineered inside Iran. Having said that, I need to also caution against really dangerous conspiracy theories that are coming out from the Syrian, the Hezbollah camp in the Middle East. I mean, they are promoting a totally offensive conspiracy theory. They now are saying, because they are part of defending the regime, and Al-Manar TV is very big on that, that the entire Arab uprisings now are the work of the United States. I mean, there is now this view, which I think is insulting to all of the Syrians, Egyptians, Libyans, and all those who sacrificed in order to revolt against the government, and they are not tool of anybody. These are the people who are not taking money from anybody. I mean, of course, there are people outside who speak on behalf of the people who do that. The last point I want to say is this. No. To Rami's point about why we're talking about Ikhwan, let's talk about the people. I mean, this sounds like a speech of Arab leaders. No, it's not about the people. Or American leaders, for that matter. I mean, if we care about the people, we need to talk now about the dangers that are embedded in the political currents, the counter-revolutions that are going on. I mean, look at Libya now. I mean, who's running Libya now? Oil companies, leftovers of the Qaddafi dictatorship, and militias who are graduated from Al-Qaeda. I mean, there's a real danger to Libya. I mean, should we not talk about that and wait? I mean, it seems to me that dangers are looming over the horizon. The same thing in Syria. In the same breath, we call for the overthrow of the regime, and we warn of the dangers on behalf of these opposition groups that are funded and controlled by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United States and Israel, who are posing danger to the legitimate grievances of the people elsewhere in the region. Thank you.
Will you join me in thanking this amazing panel?